my name is Olivier Sulpice. I work at the Serege. We are located in Aix-en-Provence and Marseille. And here on the screen, you can see the pictures of the Calanque of Marseille, and it's related to my talk, which will try to convince everybody that all the benthic calcifiers that we think about that Tyler showed are also very important for the carbon cycle after they die. So I'm going to try to explain you how do we go from a healthy calcifying ecosystem to piles of limestones such as what we see on the screen here. So I have 4 sections in this talk. I'll try to wrap it up in half an hour. The first one is about the dissolution mechanisms. It's basically a review. I'll try to keep it simple. Here's how I like to explain the dissolution reaction. Actually, you can think of any chemical reaction as a CSO, and if you want to think and find out in which direction this chemical reaction will go, you have to think about how much of the reactants or of the products of that reaction you have. So in the case of the dissolution of calcium carbonate, so here I placed on the left side a foraminifera, could be any calcium carbonate shell or skeleton. Let's say it's at equilibrium in a beaker of seawater. If you change the concentration of either calcium or of the carbonate ion in that seawater, you will break that equilibrium and something will happen. And it's very intuitive to find out in which direction it will go. For example, if you add some calcium, some carbonate ion, if you increase the alkalinity, for example, then we are not at the equilibrium anymore. There is too much weight on the right-hand side, and it will spontaneously go towards the left. It will precipitate. On the other hand, if we acidify the water, such as what we're doing globally today, then we're decreasing the carbonate ion concentration in seawater. We're creating a deficit, and calcium carbonate will spontaneously dissolve to replenish for the carbonate ion that has gone. And so there are 2 groups of factors that can explain whether a calcium carbonate mineral can dissolve or not when it's seawater. Some are related to the environment it's in, so mostly to the chemistry of the seawater in which it's in, and some factors are related to the mineral properties. So we'll go through all of that together. So a little bit of chemistry to start. So Tyler already touched base on all of these things, but here is one more reminder. So here we have the series of chemical reactions that happen that link CO2 and calcium carbonate minerals. And what you see on the right is a diagram that tells us what is the proportion of each of those 3 ions, carbonate ion, bicarbonate ion in the middle, and dissolved CO2. And all of those 3 together, summed up, they make up what we call DIC, the dissolved inorganic carbon. So today, most of the surface ocean has a pH of 8, and at this pH, most of the DIC will be under the form of the bicarbonate ion. A little bit will be composed of made up of carbonate ion, and the amount of DIC that is under the form of dissolved CO2 is actually most negligible. So what happens when calcium carbonate dissolves here, if we start this chain of reactions at the bottom, let's say we add a calcium carbonate shell in seawater, it dissolves, oops, we are releasing some carbonate ion, and that carbonate ion, because it's not totally stable in this seawater, it will actually react with some proton to give some bicarbonate ion. Now you can focus on the reactions that are in green here. So if we, let's say here we have removed some of that proton, we have removed the green proton here. So we create a deficit here, think about the seesaw again. And spontaneously, some of the dissolved CO2 in the seawater will be converted into even more bicarbonate ions. And if we lose some dissolved CO2, then we make room for even more CO2 to be taken up by the seawater. It's kind of the idea between all the projects that are about boosting the alkalinity of the ocean to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's the same idea, and in fact, calcium carbonate minerals are really good natural CO2 removers for those reasons. So if we sum up, the dissolution of those minerals neutralizes some CO2. It turns it up mostly into bicarbonate ion. And the other way, the opposite is true also. When we precipitate some calcium carbonate, we release some CO2 into seawater. Now, if we look at a map of where calcium carbonate minerals are produced at the seafloor, we see those patterns here. So when it's yellow, it's areas of the seafloor where sediments are really rich in calcium carbonates, and dark areas here are really poor into calcium carbonates. And here we can see the influence of both families of mechanisms that explain whether those calcium carbonates can survive and be buried or whether they are dissolved. We can see the influence of the environment here, mostly in the fact that the Atlantic, if we sum up, is mostly yellow. Calcium carbonates are well preserved in this basin. And on the other hand, the north of the Pacific is mostly black. Those minerals are mostly dissolved. Here, it's mostly the influence of the environment because the bottom waters that are in contact with this seafloor are much more acidic at the north of the Pacific than in the Atlantic, because those waters in the Pacific are very old, several centuries, even some millennia old, and they have had a lot of time to accumulate a lot of metabolic CO2. So they are more acidic, and therefore calcium carbonates have a harder time to be preserved here. Something else that you can see in this pattern on this map here, if you really look at the Atlantic Ocean, is that it seems that in the middle, calcium carbonates are much more preserved. Here, it's due to the mineral itself. It's due to the fact that calcium carbonate minerals are more soluble at high depths because of the increasing pressure. So basically, when we increase the pressure, they become more and more unstable, and at some point, the pressure is too high, they can't hold it anymore, and poof, they dissolve. So that's what we see here. On the ridge, the depth is not very high, and on each side, you have the abyssal plains with depths of 4 or 5 kilometers, and here the pressure is too high, and those minerals cannot be preserved anymore. So if we look at a few more chemical formulas, I promise I will not have a lot in this talk. It's almost the last time you see a chemical formula here. So here we are looking at the crystal structure of the mineral called calcite. It's the most abundant form of calcium carbonate in the ocean. And when we dissolve it, we are dissolving it with the chemical reaction that we see here on the left, which is described by an equilibrium constant, Ksp here. That's simply the ionic construction product of the calcium and of the carbonate ion that we need to in order to be at equilibrium with this calcite mineral. Okay, and at any given time or any given place in the ocean, we can define something that we call omega. It's also called the saturation state of seawater, and simply the ratio of this construction product that we have in seawater with what we should have in order to be at equilibrium. So here, if omega is 1, you have just the right amount of calcium and of carbonate, and calcite should not dissolve. If it's less than 1, then you don't have enough calcite, you don't have enough carbonate ion, one or the other, or both, and calcite should spontaneously dissolve. And here on the right, we can see how this equilibrium constant, how this Ksp, is a function of temperature and of pressure. So basically, calcite is more soluble when the temperatures are low and when the pressures are high. And it's also quite intuitive, the reason why it has this behavior. It's due to the fact that the dissolution reaction is exothermic, means that it generates some heat. So when it's very cold, it's more likely to occur. The same intuitive process happens with the pressure dependency. The dissolution reaction here frees some room. So basically, it takes more space, more volume to have 4 crystals sitting in seawater than to have it dissolved with the dissolved ions that are hidden in between the water molecules. It takes less space, so if we increase the pressure, the system will want to shrink as much as possible, and solubility will increase. And so here you have roughly the range of temperature and of pressure that we have in the ocean. Okay, so the main driver, if we consider the seafloor, globally, it's really the pressure here, because most of the seafloor is actually between 4 and 600 bars, meaning 4 kilometers and 6 kilometers depth. And here the solubility of calcite is about twice as what it is at atmospheric pressure. Now, it's not enough to look at the saturation states of calcium carbonate minerals to predict whether we are going to find them or not in sediments. We need to look at something else that we call the dissolution kinetics of those minerals. So, very briefly, imagine we have a calcite shell in seawater that is undersaturated. In theory, if we were to wait forever, this shell would dissolve. Okay, because it's more stable at the dissolved state. So let's say we are in this situation. We have a solid calcite state, calcite shell, and we know that it wants to dissolve. Well, it's not because it's undersaturated that it will happen right away. Because in between the solid calcite and the dissolved ions in water, we have to go through a transition state. So basically, we have to give the system a little bit of energy, a little kick, so that this reaction happens, and that's the field of kinetics. So kinetics govern the speed at which dissolution reaction occurs. So it's what we need to think about when we want to know for real, is the calcite preserved or not in sediments. And what governs dissolution kinetics is to a large extent controlled by the arrangement of atoms at a molecular level here. So if we zoom a little bit at the surface of a crystal, basically when we are close to equilibrium, so in a seawater that is quite with a lot of alkalinity, for example, we would be on the left on this graph, close to equilibrium. The dissolution rates are slow, and their dissolution will mostly occur through places on the crystal surface where the atoms are exposed on several sides. Okay, and it's only when omega goes below a certain threshold value of about 0.9. So after the seawater is highly undersaturated, that we can switch to other dissolution mechanisms, such as this one, the formation of heterogeneous, homogeneous hedge pits. So here dissolution can happen everywhere. There is so much energy, even in the middle of a crystal face. Now that was for the theory. Now there is reality. It's not as simple as this, because in the real ocean, if you look at the surface of calcium carbonate minerals, here I don't even know what I'm showing you here. It's just to tell you that if you zoom in, if you look at those crystals with an SEM, they have all kinds of shapes. For example, if you look at coccoliths, it's really not just a nice cube, that what we saw in the slide before. Actually, in 1 gram of coccolith 10, you have as much surface area as in the room I'm sitting in right now. So there's so much surface area, so many little pores everywhere. Then it makes the prediction of those dissolution reactions much more complicated. And also it explains that several minerals, even if they are made of the same thing, they are all made out of calcite here, what we are looking at, but they look very different. They span orders of magnitudes in terms of surface area, and that makes their ability to dissolve very different. Okay, so now here we are looking at a depth transect in the water column, here between 0 and 6 kilometers at the seafloor. Here we'll be looking at two profiles, the North Atlantic, the North Pacific. The saturation state of seawater with respect to calcite more or less always looks like something like this. It's high at the surface ocean, usually around 4, 5, 6, and it decreases quite quickly. And it's only in theory when it's below 1 that we could have dissolution. That's what we would get if we were living in a world without life that is simply ruled by thermodynamics. But in reality, we are not living in this world, and if we look at where over the depths of the water column is the alkalinity that originates from the dissolution of those materials originates, then we see that we have a very large peak of alkalinity that is being released at the surface of the ocean. It can't be driven by omega here, at least not by the omega of the water column, because it's above 1, so it has to be driven by something else, perhaps the environment. And in fact, if we look at a map of omega in the surface ocean, here we see that it's always, unless maybe it's some part just next to Siberia, it's always above 1. So according to this map, we should not have any dissolution anywhere in the surface ocean. It's obviously not the case, and it's largely because a lot of dissolution occurs actually in microenvironments, either within particles or within sediments, where the omega, the saturation states that matters, is not the omega of the water column, it's the saturation states of the pore waters, and sedimental waters are very different from the bottom waters above the seafloor. So here we're looking at a bunch of macro profiles of the amount of oxygen that we would have in the pore waters. Here the dashed line horizontal would be the sediment water interface. So using some microsensors such as with a setup such as this one, we always see that the oxygen, as soon as we enter the sediment, decreases, and at some point there is no oxygen anymore. And that's because we have some microbes that live in those sediments. They respire, they eat the dead organic matter, they consume oxygen, and they release dissolved inorganic carbon. So if we sum up, the oxygen profiles always look like this. They start at near saturation values, and they quickly decrease to 0. And this is associated to a change in color in the sediment. The thing is that we have more reactions happening beneath this oxic layer. So we still have microbes that are living and are eating organic matter even when there is no oxygen anymore. So to sum it up, as we increase with sediment depths, we are decreasing the reactivity of organic matter because the tastiest part of this organic matter pool will be eaten first. Okay, we have hungry microbes living everywhere, so of course, when they receive some fresh organic matter, they eat what is labile, what is very reactive, and they left the most unreactive parts. But the reactivity of this organic matter decreases with sediment depths, but we always have microbes that are there to eat this organic matter. And so once we run out of oxygen, we will still have some microbes that are ready to respire this organic matter, but without oxygen. So they will use other electron acceptors, such as nitrate, manganese, iron, sulfate, and eventually the organic matter itself, to generate a series of dissolved ions here, that we see here. So in terms of, it was not the last slide with chemical reactions, I'm sorry, but you just have to look at the things that are circled in red here. For all of those organic degradation pathways that I mentioned, we are actually generating a little bit of alkalinity. So when microbes degrade organic matter without oxygen, they mostly generate CO2 and very little alkalinity. But when they use nitrate or manganese or iron as a way to get their electrons, they are actually releasing alkalinity. And they can release quite high amounts of alkalinity, even so that the pH, if we were to do a depth profile of that pH, we would see an increase in the area where the microbes are respiring this organic matter without oxygen. So this can eventually slow down the dissolution of calcium carbonates that would be buried in this pile, and it could even trigger their precipitation. And that's why it's important to keep in mind that in sediments, we have microbes that are there. When they work in the presence of oxygen, they mostly acidify the pore waters, and that would lead to the dissolution of calcium carbonates. But everything below, it's not that true. It could actually be the reverse. The fact that we have microbes respiring in the absence of oxygen could lead to preserving all of that calcium carbonates. So here we see again this plot that Tyler showed just before. So we recognize on this alkalinity versus DIC plot the photosynthesis, the respiration, the dissolution, the gasification. And we have two more arrows here, the sulfate reduction and denitrification that corresponds to the contribution of the degradation of organic matter without oxygen, so using mostly nitrate and sulfate as electron acceptors. So that's important to keep in mind, especially in highly productive coastal sediments. Now, here is a study that is actually mostly focused on the deep sea floor. Here, the lines that we see corresponds to bathymetric lines. Here we would be at the area of the seafloor where we switch from sediments that are rich in calcite to sediments that are very poor in calcite. This depth is called the CCD. And it was reported a couple of years ago that these depths in which we switch from calcite rich to calcite poor sediments also correspond to a depth where we switch from a certain ecosystem composition to another. That means that when we think about the link between organic matter and microbes or animals that are living, they actually care about what the sediment, what the substrate they live on is made of. And so if we try to wrap up the interplay here between organic carbon and inorganic carbon, so you can read, instead of PIC, you could read calcium carbonates, those things really work together here, okay? When microbes are degrading organic matter in the presence of oxygen, it will lead to more dissolution. When they do so without oxygen, it will actually inhibit dissolution. And we also have a bunch of processes that link dissolution to organic matter degradation. So we don't have time to go in detail there, but it could be things like the fact that we're dissolving some calcium carbonate in sediments will decrease the permeability of sediments, can make them more muddy. You can lose some substrate that's important for some species. You can lose some physical protections that some organisms need, and you could also release eventually some substance such as dissolved organic matter. And so you have a series of positive and negative feedback that link the two. Now this section will go a little bit further into the description of what calcium carbonates are we actually talking about. So until now I just mentioned the word calcite, the mineral calcite, but in the ocean we actually find a lot of a mineral that is called aragonite, and some minerals that we call collectively magnesium calcites. All of these minerals are basically made of the same ingredients. They have the same crystal structures. The difference is the way the Lego bricks that makes those crystal structures are arranged. Okay, aragonite, for instance, has a slightly different crystal structure. It's slightly denser, but it's more soluble. It requires more energy to make. So why organisms choose to precipitate calcite or aragonite or magnesium calcites has a lot of reasons. It has some evolutionary factors in there. But what we need to remember is that in the ocean, and especially in shallow marine environments, we have minerals with a wide range of shapes, a wide range of compositions, a wide range of crystal structures. So there is really not one single reactivity, one single mineral that could describe them all. Now, if we keep this analogy with the seesaw here, what it means to have a mineral that's more soluble than calcite, like aragonite or high magnesium calcite, is that we will move the equilibrium point on the seesaw here. For example, if you have a beaker of seawater that is in equilibrium with respect to calcite, you remove the calcite, you put some aragonite in there, it will not be at equilibrium anymore, and you will actually need to add either some dissolved calciums or some dissolved carbonate ions, or both, to come back to that equilibrium. Okay? In the water column, where we see those three minerals here, aragonite would be mostly produced by plankton snails called pteropods and their cousins, Calcite would be mostly produced by foraminifera, by coccolithophores, and magnesium calcite would be mostly produced inside the fish guts, mostly. So we see that at least in deep sea sediments, we have the succession of those three minerals. So the deeper we go, the higher the pressure, the more soluble all these minerals are. And at some point, we run out of the most soluble one. We run out of magnesium calcites. A little bit deeper at the seafloor, mostly, we run out of aragonite. And in the end, if you look at what's preserved in the sedimentary core, in deep sea sediments, it's mostly calcite. It doesn't mean that the two other minerals were not here initially. They've been dissolved. And so if you think at the water column and the seafloor as something like this, then the deeper you go, the older you go, the more you're left with just the refractory minerals. Here, that's an example just with calcite in blue and aragonite, with those pteropods. In a situation on the left where we have little pteropods here, they would mostly be dissolved as soon as the aragonite saturation depth is crossed, and nothing will reach the seafloor. Now, if we live in a world where those pteropods are everywhere, they are abundant, they actually do reach the seafloor, and it's because they reach the seafloor that they dissolve there because they're highly soluble. They don't have time to be buried, and when they dissolve, they do so with the overall chemical reaction that we looked at before. They neutralize some CO2, so they make the seawater a little bit less acidic, a little bit more alkaline, and they protect calcite. So it's really the same relationship that we see between all those minerals. We always, when they are together, we always have the more soluble ones that go away first, and it's a very altruistic behavior because doing so, they help the more stable one to be preserved even more. So it's something that I tried to model a couple of years ago. So here we did a 3D model with foraminifera shells that we summarized as spheres. And we put an aragonite pteropod shell on top of that. The color here shows you the dissolution rate of calcite. So the foraminifera grains that are just around or just below the pteropod are actually not dissolving. They are protected by the fact that we have some aragonite. So it's kind of a galvanization effect, if you will. Now in shallow environments, it gets even more complicated because you don't just have calcite or aragonite, you have so many different kinds of magnesium calcites. Here you can see a histogram that shows you the percentage of magnesium in the calcite for a bunch of organisms. You can see that there is a relationship with temperature. The warmer the water, the more organisms tend to have a lot of magnesium in their calcite. And if we look at what the solubility of all those minerals look like here on the right, we see that the more magnesium there is in the calcite, the more soluble it is. So here the least soluble would be the calcite in blue. Aragonite is more soluble than calcite, and the magnesium calcites here are very complicated. They start with having more or less the same solubility as calcite, but then the more magnesium they incorporate, the more soluble they become. So if you are in an environment where you have all of those things together, then what you will see will be the dissolution in priority of the highly soluble phases. So the goniolithan, the peneroplis, and all of that preserves the less soluble minerals that are buried within this sand. So that's the focus of a new Marie Curie postdoc project of Astrid Hülen, who just started working with us at CEREJ. The idea that we're trying to investigate is that maybe to describe the reactivity of calcium carbonates, we could mimic the reactive continuum that is often used to describe the reactivity of organic matter. The idea is that there is not just one type of organic matter, right? We are made out of some fat, some muscles, a lot of different things. Same for marine organic matter. And if you look at organic matter in a sediment, the more you wait, the older this sediment gets, the more you are left with the unreactive things. And so the reactivity of that pool of organic matter decreases with time. We think we could have something like this happening in the case of calcium carbonate minerals. The more you wait, the more you left with the less reactive phase, the pure calcite, whereas the very reactive phase go away first, protecting the more stable ones. Okay, and the last section of this talk, since we are here to think of the link with the global carbon cycle, is about the carbonate sediments as the first responders to the climate crisis. Here you see two maps. Here, the top one shows you the dissolution rates of calcium carbonates at the seafloor today. And here in this paper, we used some model outputs to isolate the anthropogenic component. And that's what you see on the bottom map. Here it shows you the difference between the dissolution rates of calcium carbonates today and 200 years ago, when there wasn't much anthropogenic CO2 in the ocean. So we see that the anthropogenic dissolution mostly occurs here in the North Atlantic, because that's where we have a lot of waters that are young. They are a few decades old, and they go around Newfoundland here. So they carry a lot of all kinds of anthropogenic pollutants, mostly CO2, and this causes the seafloor to dissolve in this area. So if we do the math and we try to do a global integration of this new calcium carbonate that is dissolving today, that wasn't dissolving before, and we dissolve by the number of people on Earth, we arrive at something like 70 grams of additional calcium carbonate dissolved per capita per day. It means that it's about a handful. So every day, you can think of the fact that you are kind of dissolving one handful of white sand made out of calcium carbonate at the bottom of the ocean. Now, this thing is far from perfect because it actually misses a very important component of dissolution, which is a dissolution that's driven by respiration, by the degradation of microbes. Here you can see that along the continents, nothing is happening. It's all dark blue. So if we were to revise this map into something that, I would just keep here, into something that integrates that organic matter degradation, we would be in the situation of that what is being shown here by two studies in which Tyler was involved here. So here it tells us that in shallow sediments, because there is a lot of organic matter, on top of ocean acidification that will eventually cause those sediments to dissolve, we have an additional dissolution that doesn't really care of the saturation state of seawater. It's here because we have some organic matter, we have some microbes, and it causes a net dissolution flux that will worsen with time. So here on this plot, you can see that we can have a net dissolution even in situations where the bottom water omega is higher than 1. Here we're mostly in the case where the sand is made out of aragonite, okay? So because you have some organic matter, because you have some microbes, you have dissolution everywhere. And with ocean acidification, we could guess that all of that is going to increase. And the good news is that when it dissolves more, whether it is in shallow sediments or deep at the seafloor, it neutralizes CO2. Which brings me to the last slide. The inclusion of calcium carbonate dissolution in some main CDR studies. So here you see results from a model simulation by Fathaye, published 2 years ago. So here they modeled the alkalinity flux out of a sediment from mangroves on the top or seagrass meadows on the bottom. So they model what would happen if they would add some seagrass or some mangroves. I switched actually the... So if you add some of those productive ecosystems, you increase the alkalinity flux, and if you add some of those ecosystems and you add some calcium carbonate powders at the same time, then you increase this alkalinity flux even more. And if you translate that alkalinity flux into a CDR, into a calcium carbonate, into a carbonate dioxide removal potential, we see here that it's actually being suggested as a way to boost the way certain coastal ecosystems can sequester some CO2. So here the idea would be to repopulate those ecosystems by seagrass, by mangroves, and doing so especially in areas that contain calcium carbonate, or to add calcium carbonates to those systems. That was my last slide. So all of the results here were taken in the literature or obtained during my time at McGill, where I did my PhD, at Utrecht, where I did my postdoc, or here at Cerej, and I would like to thank all the colleagues with whom I was lucky enough to work. And I'll take any question.